Welcome back to the history of Magic the Gathering told through a card from every set. We've got a lot to cover in this video and we'll be seeing a wide variety of worlds. We'll be joining the Aether Revolt on Kaladesh, witnessing the Hour of Devastation strike Amonkhet, and venturing into the golden city of Orazca on Ixalan, before finally returning home to the comfortable and familiar world of Dominaria. Grab yourself a drink or a snack or something because this is going to be a long ride. Let's get going. Kaladesh steampunked its way into stores in September of 2016. Kaladesh brought two new innovations to the game, vehicles and the energy system. We'll talk about energy when we get to Aether Revolt, but let's discuss vehicles for the moment. After all, our card to represent the set is arguably the most powerful vehicle ever printed, Smuggler's Copter. Vehicles are artifacts with stat blocks that become artifact creatures once they are crewed. To crew a vehicle, you need to tap down any number of creatures with power equal to or greater than that vehicle's crew cost. For example, Consulate Dreadnought costs only 1 mana, and it's a 7/11. Wow, what great value! Rotting Regisaur, eat your heart out. But in order to actually use it, you're going to need to tap down creatures with a total strength of 6 or more, so it's not really as great a deal as it might appear to be. Smuggler's Copter, however, is an amazing bargain. For 2 mana, Smuggler's Copter is a free vehicle with flying. Erin requires a single creature with 1 power or more to crew it. Whenever the Copter either attacks or blocks, you may draw a card and then discard a card. Smuggler's Copter is pretty amazing. It's pretty undercosted, even factoring in the need to crew it. The crew cost of 1 is very much there, and it's still a barrier, but one which is pretty easily crossed. Smuggler's Copter was banned in Standard in January of 2017, just over 3 months after it was released. It was also banned in Pioneer in December of 2019, beating its old record as this was only 2 months after the creation of the Pioneer format. Let's look at what makes it so powerful, by examining its performance in mono-black aggro decks in Pioneer. Mono-black aggro decks in early Pioneer ran 4 copies of this card, and a huge number of 1-drops who could crew the Copter. You can put in a Knight of the Ebon Blade, or a Blood-Soaked Champion, or a Night Market Lookout, who has the advantage of draining your opponent for 1 as they hop into the driver's seat. In these decks, not only does the Copter offer a powerful attacker, but also a way of filtering through your deck to get to removal or additional creatures when you need them. Just remember when playing with the Copter not to bother crewing it the turn it comes into play, as it doesn't have haste. So we've discussed how Smuggler's Copter's power is part of the reason for its notoriety. But there's another big factor, the fact that it's colourless. Smuggler's Copter can be slotted comfortably into just about any aggressive or tempo-y deck, regardless of colour. Whether you're running a mono-black, mono-red, mono-white aggro deck, or any combination of those colours really, the Copter can be easily slotted in. This is a part of what got the card banned twice. Since it was colourless, it was just showing up everywhere, which made it utterly ubiquitous and made the meta appear stale. This links to a broader problem with Kaladesh, and in fact to all of the artifact blocks of the past. In a State of Design article of 2017, Mark Rosewater describes this issue. Normally when we make a set, we're able to spread the powerful cards over many different colours. Yes, there might be a powerful white card, a powerful blue card and a powerful black card, but it's hard to play them all in the same deck because the mana system discourages it. Artifacts though tend to be colourless, meaning that any deck that wants them can run them without the game providing any interference. The good artifacts can glom together and make a blob monster that's hard to stop, because chopping off one piece of it often isn't enough to stop it. So essentially, powerful cards of any colour can be problematic, but powerful artifacts are especially problematic because they can just slip into any deck. Steps were taken to remedy this issue of artifacts going forward. You'll notice that after Kaladesh, the number of coloured artifacts in the game massively increases. Previously, they had been used sparingly. They were the main gimmick of the Shard of Esper in a Lara block, but otherwise they only popped up every once in a while in special instances. Nowadays, there's pretty much a coloured artifact in every set, and while this does solve the blob problem, as really great artifacts can't just go into any deck now, it does slightly blur the line between what an artifact is and what an enchantment is. But I don't think this blob problem idea really tells the entire story. Kaladesh saw a marked increase in the power of the game. This is represented by the large number of bannings which occurred in 2017. Since then, the power level has continued to rise, resulting in even more bans. This has levelled off slightly in 2021, with sets like Strixhaven and Adventures in the Forgotten Realms being noticeably weaker than previous sets, especially the monstrous power level of Thronabel Drain, but nevertheless, Kaladesh placed the game on a path of rising power from which it never quite recovered. Aether Revolt improvised its way into stores in January of 2017. I mentioned earlier the unique energy system which Kaladesh block employs, so let's cycle back to that now. Artifacts on Kaladesh are powered by a substance known as Aether. Kaladesh's autocratic government, the Consulate, maintains a tight grip on this resource, enforcing quotas on how it can be used. Eventually, as the consulate grew into increasingly tyrannical heights, the populace decided that enough was enough and rebelled against them. This led to the titular Aether Revolt. Aether is represented in-game through the energy mechanic. Many cards from Kaladesh block generate and consume energy counters, which is represented by this little symbol. Energy counters are collected by a player over the course of gameplay. They're usually represented using dice, which can go on a little energy reserve card, which was included in packs. Energy sits in a slightly weird place in the game's history. It's currently not been used again since its debut in Kaladesh block, so we only really have two sets of cards that make use of it. There are enough energy cards that you can build a 60-card Pioneer or Historic deck based around the mechanic, but you'd be spread very thin trying to incorporate it into Commander. Remember that in 2016 we didn't have the Commander precons,
released alongside standard sets,
that we get today, so there wasn't as much room to include new cards then as there is now. All the same, energy is generally considered to be very powerful. We'll demonstrate this using our card of the set, Rogue Refiner. For 1 green and 1 blue mana, and then a mana of any colour, Rogue Refiner is a 3/2 which generates 2 energy and draws you a card as it comes into play. Rogue Refiner highlights what's usually seen as energy's largest issue, that it's often just included as extra icing on a card that's already pretty good. A 3/2 for free which draws you a card as it enters play is already pretty great, but 2 energy wasn't really needed here. So what does this energy let you do? Well, in an energy deck, pretty much anything. You can turn it into removal with Harnessed Lightning, tokens with cards like Whirl of Virtuoso, mana fixing with Aether Hub or Servant of the Conduit, and you can just slam anything out of the top 6 cards of your deck with it for free with Aetherworks Marble. Do you notice something about all the cards I've just mentioned? All of them consume energy, yes, but all of them generate energy as well. Harnessed Lightning by default deals 3 damage, even if it's literally the only energy card in your deck. Servant of the Conduit gives you enough energy to activate itself 2 times as it enters play, etc. In short, energy was probably made too easy to generate. For that reason, free energy cards were banned to nerf the strategy in Standard. Attune with Aether, a spell that lets you tutor for a basic land, whilst also giving you 2 points of energy for only a single green mana. Aetherworks Marble, which can bring any of the top 6 cards of your deck into play without paying their mana cost for 6 energy. And of course, our old pal here, the Rogue Refiner. Don't worry, he's far from a last Simic card we'll see getting banned in the years to come. Will we be seeing energy coming back? There is some speculation that energy may make a return in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, so if that turns out to be accurate, it'll be back pretty soon. I also imagine we'll probably get a return to the plane of Kaladesh eventually, and the energy mechanic is pretty intrinsically tied to this world's identity. It'll be good to finally have enough energy generation to make the strategy viable in Commander as well. The Wizards of the Coast are going to have to be careful not to push it too much, as it's already a pretty powerful system. Also, before we move on, a completely pointless bit of Aether Revolt trivia is that the card Frontline Rebels flavor text contains a Les Mis reference, very minorly paraphrasing the second verse of the song Do You Hear the People Sing, which goes, "Will you join in our crusade, who will be strong and stand with me? Beyond the barricade, is there a world you long to see?" So, even though, to most, Frontline Rebel is a completely forgettable common free drop, for those of you who are trying to build a musical theatre-themed Commander deck, this card is an auto-include. In April 2017, Amonkhet crept into stores. Amonkhet is based around ancient Egyptian culture and mythology. There are pyramids, chariots, gods with the bodies of humans and the heads of animals. There's even a mechanic called Embalm, which lets you turn creatures in your graveyard into mummies. But there was a second theme which ran through the set. In Magic's lore, Amonkhet is a plane ruled by Nicol Bolas, the primary villain of this stage of Magic's story, who's worshipped as the world's god pharaoh. The Gatewatch, the protagonists, arrive on Amonkhet expecting to find a barren, scarred hellscape. Instead, they find the beautiful city of Naktamun, a thriving metropolis protected from the harsh deprivations of Amonkhet's deserts by a magical barrier known as the Hekma. But something isn't quite right about Amonkhet. There's something sinister lurking just beneath the glittering facade of Naktamun. I'll let Mark Rosewater explain. The goal of this set was to create a sense of dissonance, of unease. We wanted you to feel like the Gatewatch feels, that there's something wrong with this world, but you can't quite put your finger on. To capture this, we made the mechanics feel one way, whilst having the creative elements go another. So yes, dissonance was one of the set's themes, but how do you show dissonance? What does Mark Rosewater mean when he says the mechanics feel one way, but the creative elements go another? Well, the people of Amonkhet push themselves exceedingly hard physically. They hone their bodies to physical perfection to undertake trials assigned to them by the gods to earn awards known as cartouches. You'd expect then, given the emphasis which Amonkhet's story has on the people training themselves and growing stronger, that this would be reflected through mechanics. Maybe they could use +1/+1 counters, or give creatures abilities that buff their stats, but in fact, the opposite is true. Amonkhet is built around -1/-1 counters that make creatures weaker. It's also a graveyard set, emphasising death rather than life and vitality. Finally, there's the exert mechanic. When a creature with exert attacks, you have the option of exerting it to gain a bonus effect. Exerting a creature is sort of like super tapping it. You place a little exert marker on it, or some people rotate them a further 90 degrees, and then when a creature is exerted, you don't untap them during your next turn, but instead the turn afterwards. Exert is a primary example of a mechanic which is dissonant in Amonkhet. It does nominally reflect the thematic story element of training, but rather than representing it through having your creatures grow in strength, it instead represents another aspect of training: exhaustion and burnout. Your creatures push themselves too hard, and though they do attain great results, they're ultimately left tired and tapped down. The card I'm going to use to represent Amonkhet has the exert mechanic. Now, probably the most powerful card in Amonkhet with exert is Combat Celebrant, which is a commander staple. But it's not the card I'm going to use to represent the set. Instead, let's go with Glorybringer. For 5 mana, Glorybringer is a 4/4 dragon with flying and haste. You can exert Glorybringer as it attacks to deal 4 damage to target non-dragon creature an opponent controls.
Combat Celebrant, meanwhile, is a 4/1 for free, which can be exerted to give you an additional combat phase. In Commander, this means that, by making use of some kiki-jiki cloning shenanigans, you can give yourself an infinite number of combat phases.
This more than makes up for any statistical weaknesses on the Celebrant's part. In Amonkhet Limited, though, Glorybringer is the more useful card. The fact that it has haste means that it immediately brings value to the table. Exerting it lets you remove one of your opponent's threats, and you can swing at them in the air with a big, scary dragon. Also, there's just something I find adorable about the fact that Glorybringer, this giant dragon with flames spewing from its maw and wings that stretch into the horizon, gets all tuckered out after it attacks and needs to take some time off for a rest. You do you, Glorybringer. Have a little nap, get all rested up and be your best self. As the second sun came to rest between the horns of the God Pharaoh, the hour of devastation arrived in July of 2017. Although Amonkhet block may be based on Egyptian mythology, the destruction wrought in Hour of Devastation was biblical in scope. And I mean that literally. Hour of Devastation is designed to parallel the plagues of Egypt in the Book of Exodus. We've got water turning into blood, swarms of locusts and hellfire raining from the skies. Part 8 of the Hour of Devastation story, which appropriately enough is named Hour of Devastation, is probably one of my favourite chapters in Magic's lore. I even made a weird experimental video about it early on in this channel's life, which I've linked in the description along with the story itself. Bolas defeats each member of the Gatewatch in turn, each time employing an ironic and cruel method which turns their greatest strengths against them. He wipes the memory of Jace Beleren, the Gatewatch's resident mind mage. He convinces Liliana Vess to flee, making her abandon the Gatewatch, who are just beginning to trust her as a friend. He points out to Chandra Nalaar the futility of attempting to use fire to fight the most powerful dragon in the multiverse. He uses the ley lines of Amonkhet against Nissa Ravain, who usually draws her strength from nature, and he pierces Gideon's seemingly invincible shield, putting him in an immense amount of pain and forcing him to flee. It's a really brutal moment, and probably one of the darkest chapters in Magic's lore. But it does a great job of setting up just how intimidating Bolas is as a villain as he tears through our protagonist without even breaking a sweat. The cycle of defeat cards, which represent this fight and are printed in this set, also serve as a neat parallel to the cycle of triumph cards in War of the Spark, which show the Gatewatch finally turning the tables on the Machiavellian Elder Dragon. But in any case, that's enough about the story. What card will I be using to represent the set? This is a really tough call actually, because there are two close contenders: the Scarab God and Torment of Hailfire. Ultimately though, whilst the Scarab God is an exceedingly powerful and iconic card, I think Torment just inches it out, but honestly I could go either way. Torment of Hailfire costs 2 black and X. It deals 3 damage to each opponent unless they sacrifice a non-land permanent or discard a card X number of times. Essentially, if you can find a way of generating infinite mana, or even just a very high amount, Torment of Hailfire lets you win the game. You probably don't even need me to tell you this. This card is an absolute staple in Commander, and I'm sure we've all lost our fair share of games to someone going off with this. It's very evocative as well. If you're the one casting it, it really conveys a sort of cackling supervillain vibe. You're the God Pharaoh, and everyone else is but an insect, kneeling before your unrivaled power. Oh, Ixalan. This contentious set sailed into stores in September 2017. Ixalan is a tribal set based on the Spanish Empire's colonization of the Americas in the 15th and 16th centuries. It's widely considered not to be very good. Now, I actually like Ixalan more than most. In fact, one of the earliest videos I made for this channel was called Re-Evaluating Ixalan, and it was a 19-minute long revisionist analysis of the set, arguing it has more to offer than most people think. Nevertheless, I'll concede that there is a lot wrong with the set, and it's quite clear why it's not remembered well. So, what exactly is Ixalan about? Well, like I said, it's a tribal set based around the fun theme of colonialism. Maybe that wouldn't have been my first choice, but that's what Wizards of the Coast are going with. There are 4 factions: vampire conquistadors, dinosaur riding Aztecs, Mayans, who are now mer people for one reason or another, and also there are pirates there. The idea was that there'd be 2 familiar tribes players have a lot of experience with, but now in a novel new colour. The vampires were in black, like usual, but also now in white. Merfolk are seen here both in familiar blue, but also in green. And then there are also 2 tribes that have never been fully supported before, spread out over 3 colours. There are dinosaurs, who you can find in white, red and green, and pirates, who are in blue, black and red. The big problem which most people remember when they think of Ixalan is the draft format is very on rails. In Ixalan, if at the end of Pact 1 you've got a great vampire deck going, in Pact 2, even if you're past a really good dinosaur or pirate in your colours, it's often the correct move not to pivot and put your exciting new card in your deck, but rather to take something from a tribe which you're already building. Lorwyn, the previous major tribal block in the game's history, had prevented this problem by having both changeling shape-shifting cards, which were desirable to all decks no matter what tribe they were built around, and having cards from some tribes which actually provided support for others. Morningtide, the second set of Lorwyn block, then added caring about classes into the mix, giving the tribal synergies in Lorwyn significantly more depth and texture than Ixalan, which was comparatively incredibly shallow and bare bones. As well as being linear and limited, Ixalan's also pretty crap and constructed. None of the tribes introduced in Ixalan had any real impact on standard at all. Vampires would later get a bit of time in the sun, thanks to Sorin Imperious Bloodlord and some new vampire synergies introduced in Core Set 2020, but that only happened just before rotation, and the tribes of Ixalan had spent 2 years basically lying stagnant at this point. Still, if Ixalan had one success, it was its use of double-faced cards. Ixalan gave us a series of double-faced lands, representing the set's theme of exploration. Ooh, quick side note. The theme of exploration is also utilised through the explore mechanic, which was really cool, but I think this video is probably going to be half an hour long or so already, so I don't have time to bring it up. Sorry about that. Anyway, the reverse sides of these lands would depict a destination, while the front side would show how you got there. This is most clearly represented by the card Treasure Map. Treasure Map, on its front side, has a tap effect, which lets you scry and slowly accumulate landmark tokens. Then, once the card has amassed 3 landmark tokens, it gives you free treasure and flips over into Treasure Cove. In other words, every turn you follow your treasure map, cross off notable landmarks along the way, and then finally you get to where all the treasure's buried. The card which I'm going to be using to represent the set though isn't Treasure Cove, but another one of these double-faced lands, which saw some constructed play and is even still in many cubes today. Legion's Landing is a 1-mana enchantment which creates a 1/1 vampire token with lifelink. When you attack with 3 or more creatures, however, the landing flips, transforming into Adonto, the First Fort, a legendary land which can be tapped down for white mana or can give you more vampire tokens at the cost of 3 mana apiece. This is a neat little card, both in terms of its use in white aggro decks and in terms of its flavour. You transform a little landing site into a fortified base as more and more troops arrive, represented by you attacking with 3 or more creatures. Actually, I told a bit of a lie above. There's one other success that Ixalan had. Namely, it had a disproportionately high number of meme cards, which the community is still joking about to this day. There's Revel in Riches, an alternative win-con card, which is best known for being hard countered by Negate, especially when you try to cast it on turn 40, and of course, the one and the only Colossal Dreadmaw. Rivals of Ixalan trampled like a 6/6 dinosaur into stores in January 2018. The general consensus is that it improved on what Ixalan had laid down, but that ultimately it was still a flawed set. It maintained the tribal themes of its predecessor, but cranked the complexity up ever so slightly, introducing some more nuanced cards. It also gave us the Ascend mechanic. At any point in the game, if you have 10 or more permanents, you're considered to have ascended, and you gain the bonus for the rest of the game, even if you back down to 9 or fewer permanents later on. Cards with Ascend provide a little bonus if you've ascended. Duskcharger gets +2/+2, Golden Demise only hurts your opponent's creatures rather than your own, and Skymarcher Aspirant gains flying, etc. Ascend is difficult to explain, but it's less complex than it sounds in practice. Essentially, it rewards you for either going wide, ramping, or just surviving into the mid-game. It's a fine new mechanic, but it's nothing revolutionary. The card I'm going to use to represent Rivals, though, is a part of one of my favourite standard decks that's ever existed. Curious Obsession. For a single blue mana, Curious Obsession gives the creature it's equipped onto +1/+1 and allows you to draw whenever that creature deals damage to an opponent. Unfortunately though, you have to sacrifice Curious Obsession if you don't attack with anything on one of your turns, so you need to ensure you put this card into an aggressive deck. This card initially slipped slightly beneath the radar, but but with the help of some cards from later sets, it becomes a Dominate standard tournaments as part of mono-blue tempo decks. At the first Mythic Championship in Cleveland in February 2019, mono-blue tempo decks featuring Curious Obsession made up 3 of the 8 decks in the top 8, including the deck piloted by the tournament's winner, Autumn Burchett. So how do these mono-blue tempo decks work, and why do I like them so much? Well, step 1, you play a low-cost evasive creature. Typically these decks would include the unblockable Mist-Cloaked Herald, Terramander, which could be buffed up to become stronger in the late game, or Styron Storm Tamer, which has some utility as a protective card. Step 2, on your second turn you cast Curious Obsession on that 1-drop, and you swing in, dealing 2 damage and drawing a card. Step 3, repeat, drawing more and more cards each turn and slowly chipping away at your opponent. Multiple Curious Obsessions can be stacked to grant you even more card draw, and since you're in mono blue, you have a whole suite of counter spells to stop your opponent's plans from coming to fruition. If your creature ever gets threatened, you sacrifice a Storm Tamer to protect them, or use Dive Down to grant them hexproof, and a little bit of extra toughness to keep them safe. The card Tempest Djinn from Dominaria, the next set we'll be looking at, could also be brought in to really put the pressure on your opponents. Since the only lands in your deck are islands, Tempest Djinn's power could quickly spiral to great heights. If that description alone hasn't sold you on why this deck is fun, let me gush some more. First of all, it's a mono-blue aggressive deck. Those don't come around terribly often, so it's just really novel to see. Secondly, it was incredibly cheap to put together. There wasn't a single mythic rare in most builds of the deck, including the one which Burchett piloted to victory. There aren't even any non-basic lands, it's just islands, and none of these cards even had double-digit prices, with many of them costing literal pennies. This was a fun, tournament-viable deck at an absurdly low cost. What's not to love? So yes, Rivals of Ixalan injected a bit more complexity into the tribal gameplay of Ixalan, which many considered to be too simple, but more importantly, it gave us the starting point for one of my favourite standard decks which has ever seen play. We've looked at a lot of sets today, but this next one is one of the greats. Dominaria, released in April of 2018, returning to Magic's most iconic and most beloved plane as a celebration of the game's 25-year anniversary. The most powerful card from a set is Teferi, Hero of Dominaria. Well, maybe it's Mox Amber, but they're both strong in very different ways. For a white, a blue, and 3 mana of any colour, Teferi comes into play with 4 loyalty. He has a +1 ability which draws you a card and lets you untap 2 lands at the end of your turn, ensuring in a white-blue control deck that you'll always have a steady supply of cards and mana up to counter your opponent's spells. He has a -3 ability which shoves a non-land permanent into its owner's library third from the top, and he has a -8 which lets you exile your opponent's permanents each time you draw a card. Teferi is an incredibly powerful planeswalker. He wasn't the first busted Teferi card printed, and he certainly won't be the last. He's also not the card I'm using to represent this set. Did I just put a plot twist into my Magic the Gathering analysis video? That's right, I think I did. We've talked about several supremely powerful Planeswalker cards in this series so far. Just last episode we were talking about Liliana, Heretical Healer. Teferi, Hero of Dominaria, along with Teferi, Time Raveler and Teferi, Master of Time, have absolutely earned their place amongst the pantheon of great Planeswalkers. But Dominaria is a set that's memorable not so much because of its power level, but because of its incredibly evocative theme. Teferi does help signpost us towards that theme. Teferi is a chronomancer, in other words, a time mage. You can see this reflected in his abilities. The card draw on his +1 represents him drawing resources from the future into the present, while the lands he untapped with the same effect represent him rewinding time so the resources of the land are not exhausted. His -3, where he places a threat into your opponent's library, represents him sealing an adversary away at a later point in the timeline, and his exile effect represents him locking challenges out of the timeline completely. Dominaria is a set all about time, but more specifically, it's a set about history. Both the history of the fictional plane of Dominaria, which has been home to many of Magic's most memorable stories, and also a set about the history of the game itself. Richard Garfield, Magic's original creator, was retrieved from his secret underground lair, where at the time assumingly he was working on Artifact and Keyforge, and he assisted with the design of Dominaria. The first set he'd worked on since Innistrad in 2011. There could be nobody better than Magic's original creator to work on a set based around the game's history. History was not actually a new theme for Dominaria to tackle. Antiquities, back in 1994, had been a set based around digging up ancient Fran relics and learning of the plane's past. Similarly, the events of Time Sparrow Block, which was set on Dominaria, featured time-shifted cards from the past. This theme was achieved through the use of the term historic, not to be confused with the format of the same name. Historic, which is a term which was used to batch certain kinds of cards together in Dominaria. Artifacts, sagas, more on those in a bit, and anything legendary, which includes legendary creatures as you'd expect, along with a new cycle of legendary sorceries, which were included in the set. Ooh, and a rules change also made Planeswalkers legendary from Dominaria onwards, so they count too. In other words, notable artifacts, stories, figures and events were considered historic. Many cards from Dominaria were made to care about other cards being historic. For example, Joyra Weatherlight Captain draws you a card whenever you cast a historic spell, Joyra's Familiar makes all of your historic cards cost 1 mana less, and my personal favourite, Mishra's Self-Replicator, makes an identical clone of itself for 1 whenever you cast a historic spell. Quick side note, why does nobody play Mishra's Self-Replicator? It's such a fun card. I mean, yes, I know the answer to that is that it's a 2/2 for 5 mana, but you know the clones it makes also have its ability. So 1 copy replicates into 2, then those replicate into 4, then those replicate into 8, and it just keeps exponentially growing as long as you have the mana to pour into activating that effect. At least until your opponent plays a Wrath of God and wipes out all your little replicators at once. Okay, I get why nobody plays Mishra's Self-Replicator, but I maintain that it's fantastically fun, and I would seriously recommend you try it out. Okay, tangent over, on with the video. Sagas are probably the most evocative way which Dominaria conveys the idea of history. They're based upon an old design for Planeswalkers, where initially they'd just activate one effect after another, but this was deemed to make the Planeswalkers feel as if they didn't have any agency. However, this same system works perfectly as a way of telling a story, where sections happen one after another in a predetermined sequential order. Initially, designs for sagas were supposed to advance from step to step, based upon you achieving certain gameplay objectives, but ultimately it was decided they'd just unfold in 3 steps. The first happening when you played the card, and the next in the opening stages of your next 2 turns. What better way to tell a story than with a 3-act structure? One of the coolest things about sagas is highlighted by Kelly Diggs in a podcast he did with Mark Rosewater.
No, and the sagas, for Dominaria especially, I was really keen that creatively the sagas would all represent in-world documents or objects whose job is to convey history. And some of them, like the Antiquities War, their name actually comes from previously established in-world documents. Other ones we made up, but again, then we quoted them. The Eldest Reborn about Nicol Bolas is one that we made up, but then quoted. So the implication that they're all in-world documents and these are illustrations or performances or whatever, or even visual representations of these stories.
We can see this very clearly in Dominaria. Triumph of Gerard as a statue, Time of Ice as a banner, Phyrexian Scriptures as an altar of worship, has gets taken even further with sagas in later sets. In Kaldheim, the artwork for the cards Binding of the Old Gods and the Three Seasons don't feature paintings, but instead are photographs of real-life, beautiful handcrafted wood carvings. This is some next-level thematic commitment. So, since sagas are a new inclusion in a set built around the past, let's make a saga our card to represent the set. Let's go with History of Benalia. Like the rest of the sagas, the artwork on History of Benalia is phenomenal. It depicts a beautiful stained glass window, which, fun fact, can also be seen on the artwork for the card Short Sword. History of Benalia costs 2 white and then 1 mana of any colour. Over 2 turns, it gives you 2 white knight tokens with Vigilance, and then on the 3rd turn it gives all of your knights +2/+1. Knight Tribal was a theme in Dominaria, but even out of that context, History of Benalia is still pretty good. The card saw a great deal of play in Standard, although it did drop off afterwards. It's still pretty good though. Just like the set it debuted in. If you haven't played Dominaria Limited yet, I would strongly recommend giving it a go the next time the opportunity arises, either on Magic Online or MTG Arena. This set is one of the greats. Let's hope Dominaria United and Brothers War, which is due for release in 2022, are just as good. This has been a long one. We've torn through the remainder of the 2 set blocks, and now, with Dominaria, we're in the modern era, where blocks aren't really a thing anymore, and they just release sets on whatever planes they want, with whatever themes they want, whenever they want to. Next time though, we'll be looking at the sets which comprise the rest of the Bolas arc, a long-running Magic storyline which I referenced a bit earlier in this video. We'll see core sets returning with Core Set 2019, which themes itself all around the Elder Dragon Planeswalker. Then we'll head back to Ravnica for the 3rd time for the sets Guilds of Ravnica, Ravnica Allegiance, and War of the Spark. I'll see you next time.